2 Kings chapter number 7, and Brother Jay wasn't here last week, and we appreciate the fact that he's back this Sunday. But 2 Kings chapter number 7, Brother Jay, last week we went over the end of chapter number 6, the ending of chapter number 6 into chapter number 7. And so, like I told him last week, it almost, I do find it a little, the ending of chapter number 6 almost looks like you would think it would be the start of chapter number 7, starting at about verse number 24, where it says, "It came to pass after this that Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, gathered all his hosts and went up and besieged Samaria." It almost looks like that's all one, it's just one passage right there from 24 right there all the way to 20 of verse number 7. But anyway, so we talked about how that the king of Syria had besieged Samaria, and he had brought his whole host, and he'd encamped Samaria, and instead of going in and fighting them, he just went in and said, nobody's getting in, nobody's getting out, there's no food getting in. He cut off the supply chain, and so they were starving. And the lady came to the king, and said, "Hey, I made a deal with this woman." She said, "We'll boil your son today, and tomorrow we'll boil my son." And we boiled my son, but didn't boil her son. And so the king, if you remember from last week, the king rent his clothes, and he was walking around in sackcloth. And we talked about how that he was walking around in sackcloth, but no one knew it because he still had his royal apparel on. And how many people do we walk by every day that have their have an outward covering on to make it appear like everything's okay, but inwardly they're walking around with sackcloth on. And so we talked about that, and then we talked about how that the king was so close. He was so close to making the right decision. He even said, he told that woman, "If the Lord can't help you, what do you want me to do?" And so he was so close, so many times he was so close to being where he needed to be. But in verse number 31, it says, then he said, "God, do so and more also to me, if the head of Elisha the son of Shaphat shall stand on him this day." And Brother Jay, he was so close. He was so close, and we read 2 Chronicles 7:14, and we're like, hey, how could he be that close? Just so close. And how many times are people so close to getting the help they need from God? And right at the end, right when they get right to the point of they're right there, they're like, "No, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to go a different direction." And so the king said, "Hey," he said, "I'm going to, I know how I'll fix this. Not I'm going to go talk to Elisha because I've seen the miracles that Elisha's done. Not, hey, I'm going to repent and trust God. None of that." He said, "I'm going to take the head of Elisha off his head." And we talked about how he sent the messenger, and Elisha's sitting there and he's talking to the elders and he said, "Hey, here he comes. Grab him, hold him against the door because the sound of his master's feet's right behind him." So here comes his master, and so he tells him, "Hey, tomorrow it's going to be tomorrow they're going to sell a shekel of fine flour, or a shekel. They're going to sell a thing of fine flour for a shekel, and 2 things of barley for a shekel." And so there was a lord on whose hand the king was leaning, and he's like, if God opened up the windows of heaven, that's not going to happen. Even if God opened up the windows of heaven, I don't believe that's going to happen. And Elisha tells him, he said, "All right, buddy," he said, you're going to see it with your eyes, but you're not going to get to enjoy it." And so that's where we stopped, right there. That's where we stopped. We got to that point right there where, again, like I said, in verse number 2 of chapter number 7, he says, "Behold, thou shalt see it with thine eyes, but shalt not eat thereof." And so in verse number 3, it says, "And there were 4 leprous men at the entering in of the gate, and they said one to another, Why sit we here until we die? If we say we enter into the city, then the famine is in the city, and we shall die there. And if we sit still here, we die also. Now therefore come, let us fall into the host of the Syrians. If they save us alive, we shall live. And if they kill us, we shall but die. And they rose up in the twilight to go unto the camp of the Syrians. And when they were come to the uttermost part of the camp of Syria, behold, there was no man there. For the Lord had made the host of the Syrians to hear a noise of chariots and a noise of horses, even the noise of a great host. And they said one to another, Lo, the king of Israel hath hired against us the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Egyptians to come upon us. Wherefore they arose and fled in the twilight, and left their tents and their horses and their asses, even the camp as it was, and fled for their life. And when these lepers came to the uttermost part of the camp, they went into one tent, and did eat and drink, and carried thence silver and gold and raiment, and went and hid it, and came again and entered into another tent, and carried thence also, and went and hid it. Then said they one to another, We do not well. This day is a day of good tidings, and we hold our peace. If we tarry till the morning light, some mischief will come upon us. Now therefore, come that we may go and tell the king's household. So they came and called unto the porter of the city, and they told them, saying, We came to the camp of the Syrians, and behold, there was no man there, neither voice of man, but horses tied and asses tied, and the tents as they were. And he called the porters, and they told it to the king's house within. And the king arose in the night and said unto his servants, I will now show you what the Syrians have done unto us. They know that we be hungry. Therefore are they gone out of the camp to hide themselves in the field, saying, When they come out of the city, we shall catch them alive and get into the city. And one of his servants answered and said, Let some take, I pray thee, 5 of the horses that remain, which are left in the city. Behold, they are as all the multitude of Israel that are left in it. Behold, I say, they are even as all the multitude of the Israelites that are consumed, and let us send and see. They took therefore 2 chariot horses, and the king sent after the host of the Syrians, saying, Go and see. And they went after them unto Jordan. And lo, all the way was full of garments and vessels, which the Syrians had cast away in their haste. And the messengers returned and told the king. And the people went and spoiled the tents, so a measure of fine flour was sold for a shekel, and 2 measures of barley for a shekel, according to the word of the Lord. And the king appointed the Lord on whose hand he leaned to have the charge of the gate. And the people trode upon him in the gate, and he died as the man of God had said, who spake when the king came down to him. And it came to pass, as the man of God had spoken to the king, saying, 2 measures of barley for a shekel, and a measure of fine flour for a shekel shall be tomorrow about the time in the gate of Samaria. And that Lord answered the man of God and said, Now behold, if the Lord should make windows in heaven, might such a thing be? And he said, Behold, thou shalt see it with thine eyes, but shalt not eat thereof. And so it fell out unto him, for the people trode upon him in the gate, and he died. So again, we have Elisha here, and again, we've been studying Elisha for a while now. But I love that almost everything Elisha does is unorthodox. It's just not what you'd expect, Brother Croft. It's just not exactly what you'd expect. I mean, he just comes up with something sometimes just off the cuff, and says, "Hey, this is what's going to happen." And so here we have another example of an unorthodox way that Elisha says, this is going to happen, and God makes it happen. And so this time Elisha said, "Hey, tomorrow, y'all are starving. Y'all are actually eating your own children inside Samaria. But tomorrow, it's not going to be that way. Food's going to be sold for next to nothing." And so, but this time, God decides to use, again, like I said, he didn't use an army. He didn't use an army to rescue him. If he'd have brought an army up, they could have said, well, obviously, it was the army that saved, and the king could have took some credit for it. There was no taking credit for what happened right here. There was no taking credit for it. They had to acknowledge, Brother Jay, that God did something, because they didn't do anything. And so God used these 4 lepers, and I'm just going to tell you what I read. I don't know that I agree with it, but the Jews say that they think these 4 lepers were Gehazi and his sons. That's what the Jews say. It was Gehazi and his sons who were sitting without the camp. Now again, the Bible doesn't say that. That's what the Jews, that's what the Jews say. And so, I can't say whether that's true or not true because the Bible doesn't say it, but that's the Jewish tale. And so you have these 4 lepers, and they're sitting around, and they're without the gate, Brother Parks, which is what God said to do with those who have leprosy. They're not allowed in the camp. They have to be outside the camp. And so they're sitting outside the camp, but they're still dependent on the camp because someone has to bring them something to eat. Someone has to bring them something to eat. Someone has to sustain them. And so they're sitting without the camp, and Brother Chris, if there's no food in the camp, no one's going to bring them something from outside from inside the camp to outside the camp. There's nothing to give them. And so they're sitting out there, and it looks like, and again, like I said, I'm just telling you what the Jews said, but it looks to me, and those of us men in here, we don't. I never try to claim to understand how a woman thinks because I don't understand how a woman thinks, but I do understand how most men think. I do understand it, and it just looks like a conversation amongst 4 buddies, Chris. You know what I mean? It's just 4 buddies sitting around, and if you've ever sat around, you guys are just kind of just having normal conversation, and one guy finally comes up with an idea. He's like, "Hey, what are we doing? What are we doing? Well, we're sitting here. We're about to starve to death. No one's coming from inside the camp. They can't rescue us because they can't rescue themselves. I don't know if you noticed, but the last time we saw the king wasn't wearing his royal clothes anymore. He's wearing sackcloth. He's wearing sackcloth, and all you can hear is weeping and wailing from inside the city. And so, what are we doing? We're sitting here. And why are we going to sit here till we die?" And that's a pretty good statement. That's a pretty good statement. Why are we sitting here till we die? It's good to evaluate where you're at. It's good to evaluate. Why are we sitting here right here? We got nothing going on. We got no promise of any kind of help. And why are we going to sit here till we die? And so they're sitting there, and they agree amongst themselves. They're like, you know what? What's the point? If we sit here, we're going to die. The camp's not going to bring us anything. The city of Samaria, they're not sending us anything. Let's just go down to the Syrians and just see what happens. And this was God putting it in these lepers' heart. It was God putting it in their heart to do this. And so they were just following the nudge from the Spirit of God to say, hey, you know what? Let's just see what the Syrians, what they would do for us. And so they say, you know what? All right, let's go. And what they say is in verse number 4, it says, "And the Syrians, if they save us alive, we shall live, and if they kill us, we shall but die." Brother Jay, it's hard to, when someone's not worried about dying, it's hard to threaten them with death. I don't remember the name of the preacher, but the guy tried to mug him on the elevator. He's like, "What are you going to do, kill me? You just threatened me with heaven. You threatened me with heaven." And the guy that he was going to mug him got under conviction and actually got saved because he was so tore up because the guy just like, "What are you going to do? You just threatened me with heaven." And so it's a good thing. It's a good thing for us to live that way, Brother Jay. It's a good thing for us to live that way, Brother Parks. Sometimes it almost bothers me. And again, I want to live until, I want to live every second that God wants me to live, and I don't want to live 1 second past what God wants me to live. That's my thought. But it almost bothers me sometimes as how hard some people will fight they'll do everything possible because they're scared to die. And if you're truly saved and you truly believe that God has saved you and that there is life after death, death's not something we as Christians should fear. It's not something we should fear. Again, like I said, I'm not saying don't go to the doctor. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying, sometimes, Brother Parks, it bothers me that people who claim to be Christians are so scared of death. They're just, they're scared to death of it. And I understand that God gives grace and He doesn't give dying grace till it's time to die. But, I understand that. But, we should not fear death. If any people, of any people on earth that should not fear death, it should be Christians. It should be Christians that should be able to face up to it and not be afraid. But here you have these lepers, and again, their existence was a miserable existence. I mean, if you went from living inside, living with your family, to all of a sudden being cast out, which is basically what they were. They were cast out. Now they're living outside. It's not a fun existence. Now here God says, I can use these people. Why? Because they have the right spirit. They have the right attitude. They're like, hey, we're not scared of the Syrians. We're not scared of the Syrians. We'll go down and just see what happens. And he said, hey, we'll go down and we shall but die. I mean, that's all they can threaten us with, and we're going to die anyway, so hey, what's the big deal? So it says in verse number 5, it says they rose up in the twilight. So it was early nighttime that they get up, and they go to the camp of the Syrians, and again they come down, and I just picture them, Brother Parks. They come down, and no doubt they would have had the conversation. I mean, how are we going to come? We don't want to come real aggressive because then they'll just shoot us. But and we really, we just want to come in and just kind of announce ourselves and say, hey, we're just here. We just want something to eat or whatever. And they're coming down, and they're like, y'all notice something? It's awful quiet. It's awful quiet. Sure is quiet. I mean, you'd think even if the army was asleep, you'd still think there'd be some people up, some guards up. You'd hear some people snoring. I don't know if y'all snore like I do, but I could never. If I ever fell asleep somewhere, if I was hiding out in the woods, if I ever fall asleep, I'm going to give myself away. But you'd hear some people snoring, and you got to hear something. But they ain't hearing nothing. They might hear a horse maybe stomping around or something, maybe a horse snorting, something like that. But they're not hearing any human sounds whatsoever, Brother Parks. And they get to the camp, they get to the outskirts of the camp, and they look around, and there's nothing, Chris. And they get there, and they're like, what in the world has went on here? What has went on here? And it says in verse number 6, it says, for the Lord had made the host of the Syrians to hear a noise of chariots and a noise of horses, even a noise of a great host. Now, if you remember from the other week, we looked in chapter number 6, in verse number 15, it says, when the servant of the man of God was risen early and gone forth, behold, an host compassed the city, both with horses and chariots. And his servant said unto him, alas, master, how shall we do? And he answered, fear not, for they that be with us are more than they that be with them. And Elisha prayed, Lord, I pray thee, open his eyes that he may see. And the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire round about Elisha. So here we have them returning in chapter number 7. We have them returning in chapter number 7. And again, like I said, here, like I said the other week, here's this man of God that's completely confident in God. And here's this new servant, because Gehazi, received leprosy in the previous chapter. We have this new servant, and he's like, hey, how shall we do? He was nervous. And that man of God said, Lord, just open his eyes. And how often do we need our eyes open, our spiritual eyes open, not our physical eyes open, but our eyes open to the spiritual, that there are more for us than that are for them. And that God can fight our battles for us. We don't have to fight the battles for ourselves. God can fight the battle for us if we just learn to trust him and learn to let him fight for us. And so here is this camp in Samaria, or here is this city of Samaria that they're starving to death in there, Brother Jay. And God at any moment could have made those Syrians hear those chariots and hear those horses and hear the sound of a great host. But it came to the point where it was a challenge between the king of Israel and the prophet Elisha before it happened. Why? Because the king of Israel would not humble himself. He would not humble himself. And again, like I said, I mean, had he just come to Elisha and said, hey, I know what you did for Naaman. I know how that when we went out against Moab, how that we were thirsting to death, and God brought water in an unorthodox way to us at your word. I know how that you said, hey, the king of Syria is hiding out for you down here, and you saved my life not once, not twice, but many times. If you can do all that, surely to goodness you can help us here. But that's not what the king ever did. He said, I'll take his head off. And it was a challenge between the king of Israel and Elisha. And God said, all right, I'm gonna deliver Samaria, but I'm gonna do it in my way. And so he brought, here are those chariots again. Here are those horses again that we don't see. But God has them standing at the ready. God has them standing at the ready. And again, we don't see them. We don't hear them. Wouldn't you love for God just to open your eyes just one time in your life and you see? Wouldn't you love for God to just open your eyes just one time and say, God, just let me see one time. Just let me see. And I don't want to take away what faith does for us. I don't want to take away what faith, because if you saw it all the time, then it wouldn't be faith necessarily anymore. But wouldn't you just one time, Miss Jimmy, just one time say, God, just open my eyes just one time. Just let me see it just one time. Just once. Just so I could, just so I could just see it one time that there are more for us than there are for them. That as bad as it looks, you've got it under control. You've got a plan. No matter how bad it is, you've got this. And so it says that they heard this, and they said one to another, lo, the king of Israel hath hired against us the king of the Hittites and the king of the Egyptians to come upon us. And so, again, my question is, well, how could he have hired anyone? They've got the whole city of Samaria surrounded. There's nobody getting out. There's nobody getting in. There's no way to get past the Syrians. It's not like they had a mirror or something and they could be shining and doing little SOS with the mirror or whatever, that Morse code or whatever. They didn't have that. They had no way, but that doesn't mean that God can't bring strong delusion to the enemy's mind. That doesn't mean that God can't convince the enemy, hey, they've made a league with the kings of the Hittites. They've made a league with the kings of the Egyptians. They've made this league, and here comes this huge army. And Chris, in those Syrians' mind, that's what happened. You wonder if any of them ever lived long enough to find out the real story. If any of them ever heard what actually happened to them. Again, like I said, they would have already been, in my mind, they would have already been pre-spooked. Because of what happened whenever Elisha prayed that they would be blind. And he's like, hey, this is not the city, and I'll take you to the guy. And he leads them right down to Samaria. He leads them right down to the king, and they were helpless. They were helpless in that moment. And they fed them and they let them go. And they already been like, look, there's something strange happens when we go up there. It's not like fighting other armies when you go fight against Israel. It's not like fighting other people. We don't know who that guy is. even though God had used Elisha to cure Naaman of his leprosy, they've got someone for them. They've got that prophet up there, and he doesn't ever seem to pick up a sword, but he's doing something special for them that we can't fight against. And here you have another example where it looks like they've won. I mean, if you think about it, they're eating their children inside the city. How much longer could they hold out, Brother Jay? How much longer could the king keep them inside the city before not just the lepers outside the city, but for the people inside the city are like, look, there's no point of us staying in here anymore. There's no point in us staying inside the city anymore. We're all going to die. It's just a slow, painful death. It's just a slow, painful death versus a quick death with a sword if you don't let us out of this city. I mean, they were right at that point, Brother Parks. It was right at the point. It was, if it was a football game, there was like 10 seconds left. There was 10 seconds left, and the other team was up. And they were going to win. It was right at that point. It was fourth quarter. And it was going to be a Hail Mary pass at best. It looked like Samaria had no hope. It looked like they had no hope. And here the Syrians, they hear a noise of a great host. And it's God that's making them hear that noise. And then they convince themselves in their mind, they've made a league. They've made a league with the kings of the Egyptians and the kings of the Hittites. And so here you have these lepers. They come walking into this camp. And again, Israel would have had people up on the wall looking out. They never saw them leaving. They never saw the Syrians. I mean, you would have thought as many people as there were encamped around that city, somebody would have saw and said, hey, what's going on right there? They're leaving. But God didn't let the people inside the city see what was going on. God didn't let the people inside the city see what was going on. He didn't let the Syrians know what was going on. The only people that found out what was going on were 4 lepers who said, hey, why are we going to sit here till we die? And so they come, it says in verse 7, wherefore they arose and fled in the twilight, and they left their tents and their horses and their asses, even the camp as it was, and fled for their life. They got out of there, Chris. It wasn't just a orderly march. You know how armies do, anyone that's, which brother Tyrone was in the military, but you know how they march in order and step and they practice that and practice that and practice. I think Brother Croft, you were in the military. They practice that and practice that and practice that and practice that until they can do it in their sleep. And this was not an orderly march. This was a full 100% retreat with no one in charge. They were not stopping. There was no, hey, let's look out, make sure we're not going to get attacked or anything. There was none of that. They fled for their lives. They were convinced simply in their mind, because there was nothing there. They were convinced in their mind that if they didn't get out of there and get out of there soon, they were going to be killed. And so they took off. And it looks like, because what you read a little bit later, it looks like that they started to carry not, some of their stuff. But it looks like almost like they decided, hey, my garment is slowing me down. So they're taking garments off and throwing garments off. Anything they had that was hindering them from escaping, they just left it, they left a trail for even a blind man to follow. They left a trail for even a blind man to follow, to say, hey, look, right all the way. It says they follow, whenever the king sends them out, he goes all the way up to Jordan, and there's just this trail of just stuff that they've discarded along the way. And so here you have in verse number 8, the lepers come to the camp. The lepers show up at the camp. And they show up at the camp, and again, they look around. They're like, there is no one here. And they walk into that first camp, Brother Jay, and none of us have probably ever been as hungry as what those lepers were. But anyone that's ever been hungry, and you walk in and there's food on the table. I mean, for those of us who work, and for me, I work in Atlanta a lot, and I'll call my wife. I'll be like, hey, I'll be home in 1 hour. I'll be home in 1 hour. Whatever time it is right now, I'll be home in 1 hour. And Miss Jimmy, there's nothing like you open the door on the house and you smell the food, Brother Croft. I mean, you open the door. Sometimes if the wind is open, that smell is out there in the yard a little bit, and you're like, oh, I mean, that is a beautiful sight and smell to a hungry man. And here these lepers come in, and again, like I said, they were willing to just die if that's what happened. And they come to the camp, and they open that tent up, and there's a table sitting there, and there's food sitting on the table, and there's something to drink sitting there on the table. And they look around at each other and like, well, boys, it worked out better than what we thought. This worked out better than what we thought. They've already made supper for us. And they sit down at that table, and they sit down and they start eating and they drink. And they're like, would you look at that, boys? They left us a little silver. Would you look at that right there? Look at what they left right there. I tell you what, boys, let's take that. And they take it out and they go and they hide it. And then they come back and they go to the next tent. And Brother Chris, there's more food. There's more food. My mother-in-law was talking about a place that she went and ate at. It's one of those real fancy restaurants, because that's what my mother-in-law does. She eats at fancy restaurants, anyway, no, my brother-in-law and them take her to nice places on Saturday, and they treat her good on Saturday. And it was one of them restaurants where you have a card. And it's green when like, bring me more food, and you flip it over and it's red when you're done eating. And so those Syrians, they come in and they're like, hey, look, boys, we got another green card. Look at this right here. We come in and they were ready to eat too. And no doubt they ate a little bit more, and then they looked around and said, oh, they left us some silver as well. And they left us some nice garments as well. I tell you what. This is better than the 99-cent day at the Goodwill right here. I mean, this is pretty nice. And they start taking their stuff. They start taking stuff and they hide it. And it's kind of amusing to me, because it seems like they're almost a little bit superstitious. They say in verse number 9, again, like I said, I love the fact that they seem to be buddies, Brother Jay, because they're always having a conference amongst themselves. And it said in verse number 9, then they said one to another, we do not well. This day is a day of good tidings, and we hold our peace. They're like, look, I mean, we can't eat up all the food they got here. I mean, they had the whole Syrian army was out here. It's just 4 of us. We can't eat all the food. And even if we did carry off all the silver and all the stuff, it's going to take us weeks to do all that. We can't keep this a secret. If we tarry till the morning light, some mischief will come upon us. Again, like I said, they were a little bit superstitious, Brother Parks. They're like, hey, well, we can't hide this. We can't not tell this. We can't be the only ones that enjoy this right here. Now, therefore, come that we may go and tell the king's household. We're going to go tell the king. And they didn't know that they were doing God's business. They didn't know that they were doing God's work. They didn't know when they were sitting there and said, hey, why sit we here till we die, that they were doing God's work. They didn't have any idea that when they came and told the king that it was making the prophet Elisha's words come true. It was making his words about to come true. They had no idea that that's what was going on. They didn't have a clue. And I love when other people have no clue and they make God true. They have no clue. They didn't even understand. But they came and they called unto the porter of the city in verse number 10, and they told them, saying, we came to the camp of the Syrians, behold, there was no man there, neither voice of man, but horses tied and asses tied, and the tents as they were. And they're like, yeah, y'all ain't going to believe this. I mean, We show up at the city, we show up down there at the camp of the Syrians, and everything's there but people. Everything is there but people. Horses are there, asses are there, all their silver is there, all their food is there, everything is there. But the Syrians, they're just gone. And in verse number 11, they called the porters and they told it to the king's house within. Again, verse number 12, here is the king of Israel swinging and missing again. How many chances does a man get? Obviously, by what's about to happen in chapter number 10, he doesn't get many more chances. But how many chances, Brother Croft? All the king of Israel had to say was, you know what, that man of God said something like this was going to happen. Why do people have to be so stubborn? Why do people, especially when you think king of Israel, you would think, well, possibly a religious man? But unfortunately, again, like I said, he was worshiping Jeroboam's calves, not God, not the Lord. And so, again, here's another chance for him, Brother Parks. Another chance. He's walking around in sackcloth, and the city of Samaria is about to be completely wiped out. And he's walking around in sackcloth, and he has zero options. He's not doing anything. They had to come call him and say, hey, you ain't going to believe what we're hearing. And Brother Jay, instead of saying, you know what, I was wrong. I was wrong. The Lord on whose hand I was leaning on was wrong. And that man of God, every time he's put to the test, has been right. Every single time that man of God has been put to the test, he was right. I don't care that me and him have this personality conflict. I don't care that he said he wouldn't even look at me in the face. It doesn't matter, because every time that man of God's been tested, he's right and I'm wrong. But that's not what he does. How can he be that stubborn? How can he be that stubborn? And he said, hey, look, he said, I'm going to show y'all something. Because I'm the king, and y'all have to understand. You ever met someone that just, even when they're wrong, they have to tell you how right they are? Doesn't it drive you crazy? My wife said she married a guy like that, but, even when they're wrong, they have to tell you how right they are. Like he's in charge of the situation. He's not in charge of the situation. He doesn't know what's going on. He doesn't have a clue. And instead of going back and sitting in his house, Chris, and saying, you know what, that man of God said, that tomorrow we're going to be eating good. Instead of going and telling his wife, hey, clean the best forks off, clean the best knives off, we're going to be eating tomorrow. That's not what he did. It says, and the king arose in the night and said unto his servants, I will now show you what the Syrians have done to us. He said, I'm going to show y'all boys, this is a trap. This is a straight up trap. Them Syrians, they're smart folks. They are smart folks. They know we're starving. They know we're hungry. And they know that if they even hear that there's food outside the camp, there's no way I'm going to be able to hold these people back. They know that. And so they've set us up, Brother Jay. They have set us up. This is a trap. It's a straight up trap. He's finally figured out how to get me, and he's got me. And I'm about to show y'all boys that all this is a trap. They know that we be hungry. Therefore they gone out of the camp to hide themselves in the field, saying, when they come out of the city, we shall catch them alive and get into the city. They're just sitting out there, and they're hiding, and they're waiting, and as soon as we come out of the city, they're coming into the city, and they're taking it over. And he was so wrong. He was so wrong. Again, like I said, sometimes people can be so wrong, but because they're adamant about it, you're like, well, maybe he's right. Maybe he's right. That's not, we know how the story ends. But you understand, a lot of times someone, they'll lead people astray just because they're adamant. Just because they're just dogmatic about it. Absolutely, this is what's going on. All right. Sounds like he knows what he's talking about. And the sheep follow. And so you have here the king of Israel who's 100% wrong. Militarily, it sounds correct. Militarily, it makes sense. Brother Jay, if you've compassed the city about and you've starved that city out and then you pulled back and said, hey, there's food out here, militarily, Brother Parks, it makes sense. But spiritually, his spiritual eyes were still not opened. And instead of saying, hey, that man of God said we were going to eat tomorrow, he said no. He's still thinking with his military mind. He's still thinking with his natural mind. He's still refusing to acknowledge that man of God, every time that man of God was put to the test, that man of God was right. Would not acknowledge it. Would not. And so it says in verse number 13, it says, one of his servants answered and said, let some take, I pray thee, 5 of the horses that remain which are left in the city. Look at what they say. Behold, they are as all the multitude of Israel that are left in it. Behold, I say, they are even as the multitude of Israelites that are consumed. It was bad times in the city. It was terrible. I mean, that one woman eating her child, that probably wasn't the only bad thing that happened in that city. It was bad. They said that the horses, the military might of Israel was just as destroyed as the people that were in Israel. They were destroyed. They're dropping out. There are hardly any left. They're like, we'll take 5. Take 5. And it says in verse number 4, they took therefore 2 chariot horses. Didn't even say they took 2 chariots, just 2 chariot horses. 2 chariot horses, and the king sent after the host of the Syrians, saying, just go and see. So he sent some people out. He said, look, you're going to go out and you're going to spy. And I just, if y'all come back, then we're probably going to be okay. But if y'all don't come back, I guess we're just going to sit here again until we starve. But I'm not opening the gate. I'm not letting anyone else out until I know for sure that this is not a trap. Again, like I said, why didn't he just go to Elisha and say, you told me it was going to be this way, and you said it was going to be this way. But he couldn't do it. And they went after them unto Jordan. So not just where the Syrians had encamped, but all the way, they followed them all the way to Jordan, Brother Parks, all the way to Jordan. And as they're following him, it says, lo, all the way was full of garments and vessels. So whatever they decided we're going to carry with us when they fled for their life, they decided it's just weighing us down on the trip out. It's just weighing us down. I mean, if you've ever tried to carry something when you're fleeing, it's no good. It's no good. So you're like, forget this thing, forget that thing, forget this thing, and then all it is just 2 arms and 2 legs and just running for all you're worth. And that's what the Syrians did. And they left them a perfect trail to follow. Garments, vessels, garments, vessels, garments, vessels, perfect trail to follow. And it says, and they went after them unto Jordan, and lo, all the full garments, and that they cast away in their haste, and the messenger returned and told the king. Verse 16, and the people went out. He wasn't going to be able to hold the people in. He was not going to be able to hold the people in. You were not holding the people in. Once the people that were starving found out that there was food somewhere else, you're not holding them in. And the people went out and spoiled the tents of the Syrians. Again, so a measure of fine flour was sold for a shekel, and 2 measures of barley for a shekel, according to the word of the Lord. It was Elisha who said it, but it was God's word. It was Elisha who spoke the words, but it was God who told Elisha to say it this way. And verse number 17, and the king appointed the Lord on whose hand he leaned to have the charge of the gate. Hey, look, I'm going to put you in charge of something. What worse place would you want to be than in charge of the gate whenever you got a stampede? What? I mean, you know what I mean? No. Don't put me in front. Don't put me in the gate. Put me on the wall. Put me on the wall. I'm going to stand up on the wall. He's like, well, no, better not be put on the wall because I'll fall off the wall. I mean, this guy right here, Brother Croft, you know, I mean, he might have been like, man, maybe the king didn't figure it out because he thought the Syrians, you know, had set him up. But maybe this Lord said, man, I should have never opened my mouth. I should have never said a word to Elisha. I should have never made fun of that man of God. When that man of God said, this is what's going to happen, maybe I should have just thought it and not said it. Maybe I should have just kept my mouth shut. Because, I mean, Elisha was immediate. He was immediate. When he said, even if God opened the windows of heaven, might this thing be? Elisha's like, you, buddy, are going to see it, but you'll never eat. It was immediate. Elisha's like, boom, you'll see it, but you'll never eat thereof. And so here you have the king say, you know, we need to kind of have a slow and orderly process. I know just the man for the job. I know just the man. He'll be able to keep the people in control. There was not going to be any keeping the people in control. None. Wasn't going to happen. And so this poor guy gets put in charge of the gate, and the next thing you know, he's laying on the ground, Brother Croft, and them people are not stopping. They're walking over him just like it was a cattle stampede, Chris. They wasn't even thinking about that guy. They marched over top of him, and can you imagine while he's laying there in the dust, and he's like, that man said I'd see it, but I'm not even going to get to eat. I'm not even going to get to eat. And it's fascinating to me that in this chapter, verse number 18, it came to pass as the man of God had spoken to the king, saying, 2 measures of barley for a shekel, a measure of fine flour for a shekel shall be tomorrow about the time of the gate of Samaria. He repeats the story. Hey, just want to remind y'all, just want to remind you, Israel, just want to remind you, Christians, that when the man of God said what God put in his heart to say, that not only did it come to pass, but I want to remind you that it came to pass exactly how it was said it was going to come to pass. He said in verse 19, and that Lord answered the man of God, said, now behold, if the Lord should make windows in heaven, might such a thing be? And he said, behold, thou shalt see it with thine eyes, but shalt not eat thereof. And so it fell out unto him, for the people trode upon him in the gate, and he died. Again, I mean, we just read that a couple verses before. But God said, no, I'm going to repeat it one more time, just because I want them to remember. I want them to remember that Elisha was my man. He was my man. He was my servant. And he was not saying the words that Elisha wanted heard. He was saying the words that I wanted spoken. That's what he was saying. He was speaking my words to that king of Israel and to that Lord. And that guy should have never opened his mouth. And so, again, like I said, we have Elisha here. And like I said, I've really enjoyed studying Elisha. But I love the unorthodox ways that Elisha, you know, just it almost seems a lot of times like it's just off the cuff. But it's from the Lord. It's God allowing him to do that. He's like, hey, you'll see it, but you're not going to eat thereof. And God rescued the children of Israel again at the word of Elisha. Not because of the king, not because of the king's army, but simply the word of Elisha said, tomorrow you're going to eat, and you're going to eat good. Thank you.